Representative Mussman, thank you so much for joining me on Ukraine Watch.
Morning. Thank you for inviting me.
So normally we talk about Ukraine on this show, but I wanted to have you on because you represent a sizable population of Ukrainian Americans in the district you represent in Illinois. And there are a couple of issues pertinent to voters right now that are getting a lot of attention, namely, criminal justice reform. And after the case of Roe v. Wade was overturned, reproductive rights. I wanted to start off by maybe sort of laying the groundwork about the current status of the law after Roe v. Wade was overturned, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
So for 50 years, we had precedent that the Supreme Court decided the Constitution of the United States provided the right to a woman to choose whether or not to have a child. And the Supreme Court recently overturned that right, basically saying that the Constitution, in their view, doesn't say that. And so they left it up to the legislature, which would be either Congress or the legislatures of the 50 states, of which you are a member of one. So your party has a majority in the legislature in Illinois.
Yes.
Where is this at now, the status of the law in Illinois when it comes to this issue?
So actually, we were very proactive. I would say your Democratic majority was actually very concerned that this exact thing would happen for quite a while. People thought that we were overreacting, but it turns out that we were right, that Roe v. Wade could be overturned. So we had proactively a few years ago actually overhauled and modernized our women's reproductive health legislation to remove our trigger law. Originally, our law said that if Roe v. Wade ever was overturned, that abortions would stop in the state of Illinois. So we specifically took that language away so that abortions could continue if Roe v. Wade ever ended. And here we are.
Okay. So there were some proposals of legislation in Congress. I think one of the more noteworthy ones was the one proposed by the Republican minority in the Senate, which would limit abortion to, I think it was not allow it after 16 weeks. I guess the takeaway for me on that one, and I have some questions for you about that, is, well, one, if that were to pass, although you'd need 60 votes in the Senate to pass anything in as far as federal law goes. But if something like that were to pass, it would supersede Illinois law, correct?
Yes, I believe it would.
Okay. And so the thing that comes to my mind is, well, okay, so Roe v. Wade was overturned, meaning the viewpoint from let's say that side of the aisle, or from people who are more conservative, is they make a moral argument about abortion, right? They make a moral argument saying that this is a human life. Some people obviously think that life begins at conception. Roe v. Wade, as I understand the logic of that decision, was sort of striking a balance in that it was saying, well, if you take a look at the trimesters of a pregnancy, or you take a look at that portion of it, and then you balance that versus the rights of a person's privacy, a person's ability to decide whether or not they're going to have a child, they said, okay, well, if you take that into account, you're giving a person basically a right and autonomy to control their life. However, the legislature proposed by the Republican minority, which would cut it off at a certain point in time, says to me the party doesn't want to ban abortion entirely. So and on the one hand, they view under certain circumstances, they would say it's allowed under law, right? However, then they would leave it up to the states after that. What's your take on that?
I think it would be messy. So part of my concern is when you create artificial timelines, right? You are sort of failing to acknowledge the fact that there's still a lot we don't know about pregnancy. Women's cycles are often very erratic and hard to predict. So to know exactly when pregnancy started and the woman was aware of the pregnancy starting, and to be aware, to be able to say, based on the measurements of your child through this ultrasound, I know that it is 15 weeks along. Now you can't have an abortion. Again, I think that we can't be quite that specific, and therefore that's really difficult. You know, again, you're creating these artificial barriers, and you're not acknowledging, again, cycles can be hard to predict. And two, you know, if you're talking about perhaps like a person with a disability who is nonverbal and has been assaulted and doesn't have the ability to tell you that something is wrong, they may be significantly farther along in their pregnancy before you realize something has happened. And based on perhaps the physicality of their body or their limitations, it may be very dangerous for them to continue on with the pregnancy. Every situation is incredibly unique, and setting those timelines fails to take that into account. And you also have to acknowledge the more barriers you put in front of a woman to access an abortion. How many clinics are there available in her community? How expensive is it? Can she save up money to pay for the procedure? She's going to have to save up money to pay for transportation. Can she get off work? You know, the more she has to accumulate those resources, the farther along she becomes in a pregnancy during that timeline. So if we're gonna put impositions like that in there, we also have to talk about how we make it easy and accessible and affordable for a woman to afford a pregnancy, even in that earliest time period. And we're not talking about that at all right now.
Okay, so do you think lawmakers should be putting any restrictions on abortions?
I do not. I believe that it is unique to every woman's situation, and she needs to make that decision in conjunction with her doctor.
So with respect to caring for the child after it's born, where do you see the role of the state in that?
Again, we're talking about most unplanned pregnancies often occur for people that don't have reliable financial means. And so if you're going to say the baby is precious, you need to back that up, and you need to care for that child after the child has arrived. And very often, again, an unplanned pregnancy tends to be an unhealthier pregnancy, meaning there are more problems with a lack of nutrition, lack of prenatal care. There could be drugs or alcohol involved. So that child, or, you know, again, often low birth weight. So if they're born preterm, they could have significant medical needs that extend out that first year and beyond. What are we doing to ensure that child has the best start possible and is supported there on out? You know, there are expenses that are going to come along with this.
So we were touching earlier upon the moral arguments surrounding this issue. And you've also talked about some of the public health concerns surrounding this issue. So do you see a balance between those two competing interests, or are they competing interests in your mind?
They shouldn't be. If you were going to say morally it is right to care for this child, you have to care for that child. And again, it's going to be expensive. So you have to put your money where your mouth is. The child has to be precious, even once it comes outside the womb, no matter how difficult that may be.
So let's talk Turkey then, in terms of legislation, in terms of what residents of Illinois can be provided with. What's the current state of affairs, and what do you think should change, if anything?
Do you mean in the ability to access abortion, or do you mean support for the pregnant person and beyond?
Yeah, I mean support for the pregnant person.
So right now, if you're pregnant, you do have the ability to access Medicaid if you don't have insurance on your own, and Medicaid should care for your prenatal care, your delivery. And actually, we were very proud that we have extended it for a year after birth. The first year after birth is an incredibly dangerous time for the mother and for the child. A lot of health concerns can erupt during that time frame, especially if you've had an unplanned and less healthy pregnancy. And we know also that many unplanned pregnancies, for a variety of reasons, are more prevalent among our Black and Brown women. They're less likely to have a healthy pregnancy. And so we want to address that in particular, and help to equalize that, make sure everything is safer for moms and babies. And that's, you know, again, that is a public expense. You know, we are putting our money where our mouth is and saying these moms and babies are valuable to us, and they deserve and need this kind of care. even then, we still know medically there's still inequality in our system, and we still have higher than in other industrialized countries rates of maternal and infant death. So even though we are offering Medicaid and other services, we still know it's not a guarantee that that mother and child is going to have a healthy end.
What do you think is the reason why there's a higher rate of infant mortality in the United States compared to other industrialized countries?
I don't know that I can speak to that. I still think that there's unequal access to insurance and actual healthcare. You know, we talk about having these things, but really, especially if you're poor, you really don't have reliable access to healthcare or proper nutrition. So there are many things that are involved in that. Again, we don't put our money where our mouth is.
What would you change about the insurance system in your state if you could?
I think that we would have to investigate opportunities to maybe not make it dependent on your job. Right now, generally, it's your job that determines the idea that you can have insurance or how affordable or how good your insurance is. And I think that's very problematic. It's certainly problematic, whatever kind of insurance you have. You know, do you have a lot of doctors that are taking your insurance? Is it hard to find someone in your network? Is it hard to get there? Transportation is a huge obstacle, being able to make appointments. You know, we talk about Medicaid being available, but a lot of doctors don't take Medicaid because Medicaid reimbursements are so low. So yes, you want government to save money and spend as little as possible. But if doctors are saying you're not even breaking even with me and I'm unwilling to accept that form of insurance, it's not really available and usable to you. So it's there's still a lot of barriers, and there's still a lot of inequality, especially when we talk about parity for mental health and for physical health. And having an unplanned pregnancy is incredibly traumatic. Um, so we need to talk about mental health. And if we talk about babies that are given up for adoption, that's another mental health strain. A lot of those young people and into adulthood will struggle with not really understanding what their history was, or not knowing why their mother gave them up. And adoptive families can struggle also, you know. So mental and physical health are incredibly important.
There are a lot of uh, people who would maybe take the view that either, well, let's take it on two tracks. Either people should be more responsible for their life choices, right? Or that the government should be less involved in people's lives and maybe opening the door more for industry to allow, less regulation in order to allow people to get jobs more easily. I'm really boiling it down to the bare of it. But I want to get your reaction to both of those things. When it comes to respect to those people that might say, well, yeah, if we're talking about an unplanned pregnancy, where do we then discuss personal responsibility? How do you view that argument or that viewpoint?
So I think it gets complex real fast, right? We're not talking about the idea that contraception is actually harder to get than a lot of people, I think, want to admit. And for some people, while they're talking about abortion, they're talking about removing the most effective forms of contraception, right? If you're gonna consider an IUD a form of abortifacient when it's one of the most effective forms of contraception you can have, and take that tool off the table, or take the pill off the table, you know, if you're going to remove all of these things and then still hold someone accountable, I think that's incredibly problematic. And it doesn't take into account how often contraception fails, right? I know I have friends who have had vasectomies, still gotten pregnant, or they attempted to use a condom and it didn't work. They didn't put it on right. It was damaged. You know, there are a lot of things that can go wrong, I think, somewhere along the way. And we're also not acknowledging enough the idea that it's not always a consensual relationship. Yes, a woman can be assaulted. 1 in 5 women are assaulted before the age of 18. We're also talking about there's dating violence, there are unhealthy relationships, there's a lot of manipulation that can happen. So, you know, even with a significant other, you may be forced into a situation where you're not really in control of your ability to use contraception. There are two people involved here. Unless we're talking about in vitro fertilization, someone else was in the room who also didn't take responsible action to wear or use contraception. And in vitro fertilization is a whole nother avenue of conversation. If we're going to talk about when life begins, what are we doing with these embryos, right? And that's huge. Are we going to deny this pathway of fertility to all of these people? And if not, why the double standard?
Yeah, well, you don't often hear about a father's responsibility in a situation like this, right? Because if you're going to be a compassionate person and you're going to look at human beings which are flawed, I mean, lawmakers are flawed, lawyers are flawed, every aspect of society, right? We're all human beings, right? We're all each one of us a sinner, if you could put it that way, right?
Yep.
So um, when I look at, for example, because I'm trained as a lawyer, I look at how the decision came down that Roe v. Wade was overturned. And the Supreme Court is saying that the Constitution says nothing about the right to an abortion. When I look at that, and I see that previously the court was saying, well, no, the Constitution does give you certain rights, including the right to privacy. That is a basis for a great deal of other rights. Now, this might get a little bit heady, and I don't want to get bogged down too much in the weeds here. But there are basically two prevailing kind of ways in which the 14th Amendment gives somebody rights. There's either the Equal Protection Clause, right, where it doesn't matter what your background is, you should be treated the same way under the law. I think everybody agrees with that. And then there's certain rights, right to life, liberty, privacy, that sort of thing. And if anything, this show, which I said before, I talk a lot about Ukraine. If anything, I think this show is about liberty and justice. And what I see happening in the way the court is handling some of these cases is that it's not just that right. It's not just about abortion. It's about a whole other slew of things that now could be eroded as far as what people can do in their lives without the government interceding into those things. Do you see it that way too? Are you worried about what's going to happen next?
Absolutely. Yes. I think that a lot of people fail to realize what a slippery slope that is. I think for some people, it was a Pandora's box. They didn't realize they were opening. They didn't intend for that to happen. But I think other people absolutely knew what the potential was, and they will pursue it.
So do you think this is sort of it's coming from the side that normally talks about liberty, right? They talk about person's sort of autonomy and what they want to do without government intervention. Do you see this restrictions in states that are restricting abortions, or in proposals for federal restrictions on abortions? Do you see that as a restriction on rights of people, on
Absolutely.
rights of people to live their life in the way they want to?
Yes. Um, because again, it ultimately, depending on how your state chooses to draft those rules, that's a life or death situation. That is you not even saying it is an optional adoption or abortion. You're talking about people who maybe have gone into medical crisis, and that child inside them is a hazard to their actual ability to live, much less live a life well. And that I find particularly alarming.
So what would you make of the argument that someone could make from the other side saying, well, we just had this global pandemic, right? And there were all of these restrictions, lockdowns on the rights of individuals to go outside, to go to work, even. When you're talking about in terms of abortion, we're talking about the right of a person to decide what their reproductive future is going to be. My body, my choice, right? Well, what do you say to those people who say, well, wait a minute, but the Democrats supported all these lockdowns. What happened to my body, my choice?
Right. And I appreciate that on the surface, it seems incredibly hypocritical. I think at the end of the day, the difference was depending on how you view it, right? When you're talking about my body, my choice for abortion, it basically impacts two entities. when you're talking about a pandemic, your body, your choice not to get a vaccine, your choice not to wear a mask or social distance, that impacts not just you, but everyone around you. You know, we had sincere reason to believe that you could be walking around asymptomatically, unknowing that you are a carrier, and spreading airborne this disease to vulnerable people who then could become sick enough to actually die, much less have their life impaired long term. Um, it it didn't impact just you, and I think there was an argument that social distancing or masking was inconvenient and it was uncomfortable, and it was significantly uncomfortable for an awful lot of people. You know, there is a psychology behind that, there's a physicality behind that. I do not want to in any way belittle how kind of traumatizing that can be for some people, but that that rose to a different kind of level, I would think. And even the vaccine, I think that there was a lot of fostered mistrust about the vaccine. But if you believed that the vaccine, again, was safe to take, then asking you to take that vaccine in order to protect everyone around you, even in the idea that you yourself were less likely to get so sick that you would go to the emergency room, that you would take up space in that hospital. Because when you took up space in that hospital, you took up medical resources that might have been needed for someone, not because of COVID, but someone who had a heart attack, kidney failure, cancer, pregnancy, whatever that was. You were sucking up resources that might have been better used someplace else. You were not alone in the universe, and your choice did impact greater society.
I guess it's complicated, right?
Yes.
Because you're dealing with human lives, and you have to balance how much of the decisions that you make as a legislator that impact people's lives, how much say do you get to in the way that people live their lives, right? Because it seems like, and maybe this is a stretch, but it seems like everyone would agree that they would like to be able to live, people should or like to be able to live their lives the way they want to live them, as long as they're not hurting anybody else, right? But then you have this balance, right? Because in terms of reproductive rights, you mentioned two entities would be affected by this. And in that situation, you're talking about the mother and the unborn child, right?
Right.
And so the the opposite argument you're going to hear from people when you say, I don't want any restrictions on abortion in this state, is, well, what about, if you're balancing the rights of people, what about the right of this unborn person? What do you have to say to that?
Again, I think it's a very difficult, it is a difficult equation. It just is. But I also think that it's a question of, are you imposing your morality on someone else? Other people have different ideas about when life begins, and that is very personal for them. So for you to say, well, life begins here for me, therefore that has to be imposed everywhere else, is that reasonable? And does that fit with the American values that we have for freedom of religion, freedom of worship, freedom of opinion? And yes, those concepts are a little more ethereal than we actually talk life and death. But again, you know, it is a question of, where does life begin for you? And is this an optional choice, or has something just seriously gone very, very wrong in your pregnancy? And at the end of the day, only one of you may come out. And how do you make that decision? That is, again, an individual moral decision that needs to be made based on the merits of that case, and by that person, by that woman, by her family, whatever that is. But to impose your morality lock, stock, and barrel on every case, not considering any unique factors, I think that's an inappropriate, it's inappropriate for government.
Okay, so there, basically you're saying there's this part of what you're saying, and I don't, and correct me if I'm wrong, is there's a separation between church and state,
Yes.
right? So morality, and you can argue about what's moral and what's not, and the law may not always intersect depending on what your viewpoint of morality is. So you can make an argument about the morality or immorality of abortion, but then whether or not what the law is not entirely a different argument, but it is a different argument than what someone might say either their God says or their moral code says. Am I getting it right as far as, or if at any point, if you disagree with me or if you have any other caveats, please interrupt me.
I think it's just a hard thing to articulate, right? These are hard concepts, I think, just to wrap your head around, much less can you say it out loud well in a way that everyone understands what we're talking about, right? Um, but I think this is part of it, even for people who are not religious, right? You have a moral viewpoint of when life starts and when you would personally cut a situation off. And I think too, we're talking about, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. People don't always get, if you would say, well, based on my moral code, I would have an abortion within this particular time frame. But what happens if you didn't know you were pregnant? What happens if you wanted the abortion, but you couldn't find a clinic, or you couldn't afford the service, or you couldn't get off work, or you just didn't have transportation and you literally couldn't get there in the time frame in which you wanted to get there? What happens for you then, right? And one person may make one decision, and another person may make a different decision. Um, and, and again, I think that there is a certain autonomy to being allowed to make those decisions. Again, and I think too, understanding what the safety net is going to be for those decisions made, that impacts a woman's decision. And if she knows, I am out there on my own with no health care, no social support, and I will be ostracized, and my child will be ostracized once they're born, and they're not going to have a good life, that's factoring into it. So society, this is a reciprocal occasion.
That's interesting, the point you make about this not being in a vacuum, right? Because we think about this in a way that sort of takes away the human story of what's going on, right? Because if somebody wanted to get pregnant and they had a healthy baby, obviously they're not going to wait till 8 months and then say, oh, suddenly I want to terminate this pregnancy. I mean, if you think about it in that regard, it sounds a little absurd. And it's interesting because if you say, you mentioned maybe somebody doesn't know they're pregnant, if you set a cutoff date, let's say it's whatever it is, 16 weeks, right? It seems hypocritical. I think I can say this. It seems hypocritical to say on the 15th week it's okay, but if you didn't know you were pregnant until 16 or 17 weeks, no, we're not. You're immoral. You're in violation of the law. It is arbitrary if you think about it. I mean, not everybody's the same. Not everybody, even the way a fetus gestates, probably not exactly on track the same way for every single human being, the same way that people don't age at the same rates, unfortunately, for some, right?
Right. So
So,
again, for our ability to just count the days, you're
yeah,
pretending that everything is happening in a tidy little chart. In the real world, it doesn't work like that.
yeah.
And many women would tell you they wish that it was on a better cycle, but for many women, it's very erratic, it's unpredictable, and a lot has to do with your nutrition, how much you exercise, your own physiology. There are so many factors that go into what influence a woman's cycle at any point in time. It's complicated.
Yeah, and you mentioned also there's this, I guess there's a scenario that's not entirely off base. If you think about somebody from a family who might be ostracized if they have an unplanned pregnancy, then what do you do? Then do you just leave someone homeless who's pregnant then?
Right.
I mean, what are the consequences on society as a whole if you have a bunch of kids that are uncared for, if you have a bunch of mothers that have no resources?
Right. So I think on one hand, we have these competing visions of this selfless Madonna who will sacrifice herself for a baby, as we believe mothers should, right? We have an ideal of what perfect mothers are, and a mother should always put the life of their child ahead of their own, and that's how it works. And we talk about wanting women to make that right choice, but then a lot of times also We don't treat them as those revered Madonnas when they carry that baby to term and become single mothers or other mothers or mothers with more children than they can reasonably care for because they weren't able to plan their pregnancies properly. You know, we talk about them being irresponsible and careless, and we tend to look down on them rather than lift them up. If you see a single dad, we tend to celebrate that person stepping up to their responsibility. We don't shame him for having a baby out of wedlock, but we'll shame the mother for having a baby out of wedlock, or we'll shame the mother for having too many children. But men don't carry that same burden. So again, societally, we don't treat them the same. You know, we talk about it in one way, but I think very often reality is something completely different. And you're right, when you have children that are not well being able to be cared for, either because they're with a parent that doesn't have the financial resources to care for them properly. There's no guarantee that any of those children will be adopted or adopted into solid families. Many children languish in orphanages or in state-sponsored care, especially if there is something, if they have medical needs, if there's special needs, if there's something concerning with them based on what happened to them during their gestation. They're even harder to adopt out. And we're not talking about those things. You know, we're talking about how tragic it is that children have traumatic childhoods in foreign countries where they languish in orphanages, but we're not envisioning that that's something that could happen here for us. And that's a reality.
Yeah, I mean, that's an issue that's near and dear to me. On this, I make, I'm quite open about it on this show. I often talk about why, I often ask my guests why, to make arguments about why a free Ukraine is within the interest of the United States. And if you would allow me to make a parallel here, we have, people in our community here in the United States that suffer as well, right? There are one of the, and in fact, let's be honest, one of the arguments that you hear against supporting Ukraine is, why are we spending money over there when we're not over here? Now, I would counter that, and we don't have to go through those issues here because I've gone through it with other guests. Namely, it has to do with mutual security and global stability and freedom generally. But let's talk about it in context of our own community, because even in your district is in the northwest suburbs of Chicago, essentially. Is that right?
Right.
But it doesn't mean that everybody in your district is just well off and happy. There are people of different means in your district, people who have, different
Right.
levels of access to resources or even opportunities, let's say.
Right.
So when we're talking about this issue of whether a woman has a right to decide to have a child or not, and the effects it has on all these things, like you're saying, I think, if whatever way you're looking at this, whether from a moral perspective or from, whichever way you're looking at it, I would hope that people could agree that we don't want to live in a community where we're ignoring people who are in a situation possibly outside of their control, where they don't have the same, at least they're not on a level playing field, right? So is that a fair assessment of where we're at with this, or your viewpoint of it? Is that it's really what's driving your decision making when you're voting for legislation about this? Is it about giving everybody, at least as far as you can possibly do as somebody who represents your district, giving everybody sort of an equal fair shake as far as you can?
Yes. I mean, again, it's such a complicated question about
Yeah, I went
your
off you for
ability
a
to
little bit. I
control.
apologize.
I mean, I think again, your ability to control if and when you're having a child is a quality of life issue for yourself and that child. And again, sometimes it's not an optional question. Sometimes it's I wanted this child, but something has gone tragically wrong. And now I need to make decisions about that outcome that really are life and death for the individual. You know, you have those two questions, right? And again, there is a societal cost, and it's a question of how much are we willing to shoulder. And I think that we struggle with those morality questions over and over and over, right? We do not have enough resources to carte blanche care for everything that we want to care for. And therefore, when you have to limit it, you're trying to create a rationale for why those limits exist, or you create a rationale for who is deserving, right? You know, we talk to people in my community all the time about, well, why are we giving foreigners aid when we aren't even caring for our own people? But when you talk about caring for your own people, again, once you start getting into the reality of how much do you care for people who are homeless or drug addicted or having an unplanned pregnancy? How much of that is, I sympathize with you as another human being who is in a really terrible situation, or how much of it is, do we blame them for the situation that they're in? Are they homeless because they're lazy? Are they drug addicted because they have low character? Are they experiencing an unplanned pregnancy because they were irresponsible and loose with their morals, right? You know, are they worthy of your precious tax dollars, and at what scale, right? I think that we struggle with those moral questions day after day after day.
Yeah. So if you're going to talk about that, one, can we do both?
Right.
Maybe that's what we're supposed to do. If we're the richest country in the world, can't we figure out a way to do both? But second, I think you're right, because if someone is to demand that another person has an unplanned pregnancy, and then also say, well, now you're a burden on the state because you're taking up resources, that sounds hypocritical to me.
Right. Again, the mother and the baby is precious, or they're not. And if you're going to force this situation to occur against their will, what are you going to do on the other side? Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I want to shift gears now. The Safety Act is something that's been getting a lot of attention. It's passed now. It's going to be law in January, correct?
It actually passed 2 years ago. So we voted on this quite some time ago. There were many components. It's a very comprehensive act. Many of the components have gone into effect on different stages. We gave most of the stages very long lead-in times to make sure, you know, we knew this was big. We knew it was big when we passed it, and we knew it was going to be controversial and upsetting for a lot of people. And those long lead-in times gave extra time for people to continue to come to the table and talk about what they wanted to see and make changes. 2 trailer bills have already passed that made modifications to the Safety Act. Now, I will say, for people who think that it has been rushed through in the cover of darkness, these were concepts, honestly, that had been introduced in bill form previously, probably over the course of many years. And there were months of public testimony leading up to the bill being introduced and voted on. So for people to say, well, we weren't aware and we were all caught off guard and no one consulted experts, that's absolutely not true. And again, the long lead-in times invited opportunity for more people to continue to come to the table and make modifications. People are at the table right now discussing what further modifications could go into effect to change what will happen January 1st. But either way, that bill has passed, yes.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. Why do you think there's so much attention to it now? Is it because of these modifications that have come recently or that have been proposed? Because I've heard that argument too, that it was rushed through.
Again, what I've learned in the legislature is there is no perfect time. If you are eager for a change to happen and it takes time to occur, then we're kicking the can down the road. We're not being responsive to people's needs. You know, we're tone deaf to what's happening. We're preserving the status quo that benefits some and not others. But if change does occur and you're not sure you like that change, then it's easy to say that it was rushed through and not thought through and not everybody got to weigh in, because otherwise we never would have passed this thing that you think isn't the right thing. There is no good time frame when you're talking about change. But I think these were changes that are needed. I think there's a lot of alarm right now in large part because of the misinformation that is flowing around about what will actually happen. So if you do think that police officers are not going to be able to arrest trespassers, if you do think the jail cell doors will simply be flung open on January 1st and prisoners will walk free, that is really alarming. And I can see why people would be upset. But that is a misinterpretation, or I would say a selective interpretation of what is drafted in the bill, and it is not true. So
Let's get into that, because that's why I like this form of conversation, this long form, because you can review all of these issues. You have time, because I've seen the social media posts. I've seen the memes, I've seen the headlines, and nobody quotes what the legislation says. And they make claims about the legislation that sound astonishing, like you were just saying. So let's talk about bail first. So the getting rid of cash bail sounds like, okay, everybody just gets to walk out of a courthouse if they're accused of a crime. Is that what's going to happen?
No. So I mean, so there is that question of, for people who already went through that pretrial process and didn't have the ability to bail themselves out, and now they're sitting in jail. If you say, well, now going forward, there isn't we're not going to discuss bail, cash money in the consideration of whether or not you're going to be able to be free pretrial or whether or not you're going to be incarcerated pretrial. There are people that are saying, well, then you're just going to have to let everybody go. But really what will happen is the judges will have to go back through and review the cases, and on the merits of the cases determine whether or not pre-trial you are a hazard to society or a flight risk and you should be retained, or whether or not under this new thought process you are safe to return home and you will come back for your trial date, which could still be months away.
Okay. So let me get into that first. So the first part is those people that are already in pretrial detention there was a bail set, but they couldn't afford it, right? So you're saying the courts are going to review those cases.
Right. So what we honestly want to move toward is a risk-based assessment, just like the federal government uses, right? The federal government doesn't rely on cash bail. So your ability to be in or out pre-trial shouldn't be dependent on how much money you have, right? That's not safe for society. If you have committed murder and you're likely to go out and harm further people based on whatever it is you've been accused of, the idea that you have enough money to pay your bail shouldn't be the deciding factor of you being in or out. It's the fact that you are a risk to society that should keep you in or out. And that's what we want to move for. The cash system is inherently unequal and unfair and honestly racist. And I think that we have
What's
to come to
racist
acknowledge
about
that.
it?
I would argue that over time, if we really want to be self-reflective, we can look back and look at policies that were put into place that ultimately created a universe where Black and brown people historically met disadvantages. We're harder for them to get jobs, harder for them to be paid. Historically, they don't get paid as much for the same work as Caucasian people. So we've sort of societally created a universe where they're more likely to be poor. And so if they're more likely to be poor and unable to pay their bail, then you are disproportionately going to see more Black and brown people incarcerated, not because they're actually more dangerous, but simply because they didn't have the money. And so Caucasian people with money get out of jail for committing the same crime that Black and brown people are stuck in jail for, again, not because they're a hazard, but because they didn't have enough money to pay the bail. And now you say, well, there's more Black and brown people in jail than there are white people. So Black and brown people must, by predisposition, be more likely to be criminals and be more likely to be hazardous to us. And I think
it's about causation versus correlation, right? So no doubt about it, there was up until, I mean, if you see a person of color with gray hair, they might have been a victim of unfair rules in this society, right? There's Jim Crow. That's within, I mean, I'm 40 years old, but that's within the time frame of my parents' generation. So it's not that far off. Redlining is within, it's one person ago. It's not even one person ago. Those people
Well,
are
it's still
still alive.
happening.
Those people are still alive. So obviously, the way that things shook out in this country had a lot to do with how people treated each other based on what their skin color was.
Yes.
And you can't say you just can't say that that has no reverberation on the current status of things. And maybe even now I'm sort of preaching maybe, but maybe even if even if all the players in the current criminal justice system, even if you could say, let's say nobody's racist anymore, right? I'm not saying they're not. I'm just saying let's imagine a world where in the current criminal justice system nobody's racist anymore. You've built the system on a foundation that had mechanisms in it that
Yes.
didn't open the door for certain people just based on what they looked like. So you still have remnants of that. So I can see where you're coming from there. And I I want to clarify too, when you're saying cash bail versus no bail, it doesn't mean that you're just going to, there's certain crimes that people are just going to, if they're accused of, they just don't have to sit and be detained while they're waiting for trial. It depends on, each one is a case by case basis with the judge's discretion, right?
Right. Despite what some of those posts have said, there is not a list of non-detainable defenses. The judge always retains the right to detain someone if they are considered a flight risk, not going to come back for their trial date, if they're deemed a hazard to an individual in society, that if you're released, you could go out and harm someone, or if you are a hazard to society at large. The judge has to determine that based on the merits of the case. Um,
Okay.
and it is a high bar. You know, you're talking about taking people who have been accused of a crime, not guilty of a crime, accused of a crime, and taking them out of their lives and basically locking them in a cage, as it has been described. So you that is not a small thing to interrupt their life. And we want judges to take that responsibility very seriously. And there are high metrics to say you really need to think about what you're doing and whether or not this person warrants that. You weighing their own rights and the rights of society. You know, again, this is serious for both people, for both sides, and that's a lot of weight for judges to carry. We know that.
Yeah, I mean, being a lawyer and being in the legal community, I hear a lot about what's been referred to as the Innocence Project. I mean, the fact that this exists is basically there are people who were incarcerated who clearly for whatever reason the state didn't make their case, but they got convicted anyway. And then we're looking back at these cases and the flawed aspects of them, and a lot of people are getting released. So there are two things here. One is you haven't even been convicted yet. And if you're living, let's say you're living paycheck to paycheck,
Right.
that's a huge, I mean, you can just imagine what a huge disruption that would be just to get behind on bills if you're just barely making
Right.
it as it is.
So for many of these people, they will be incarcerated. They're going to lose their jobs. They're going to lose their apartment. They could lose custody of their children. And then a few months in, they actually go to trial and they're proven not guilty of the crime they were accused of. And then we release them back to what? Right now they've got all of these things on the record, which makes it that much harder for them to get their life back together. Who wants to rent to them after that? After after you have an eviction on your record because you just disappeared and didn't pay your rent, no one's going to rent to you now, right? We know statistically that the more time you spend in jail, any time in jail, even if it's a few days that you spend in jail, you are more likely to commit a crime in the future. So if the goal is to reduce crime, we need to think seriously about how we reduce the amount of time people are spending in jail, because there is a correlation there.
Yeah, and not to disparage public defenders, but it's just a fact that sometimes if you have more resources, if you're able to pay for adequate counsel, you have a better shot. If you didn't do something, you have a better shot at beating the case if you have adequate counsel. There are a lot of things involved in this. I wanted to touch a little bit about that comment you made about more likely to commit a crime. What do you think the reason is for that?
Again,
I
I
mean,
think a
there's a
couple of things.
correlation there, but do we have information about the causation there?
So
That's a,
I'm not an expert in that, but
yeah,
I would say I think you kind of have two things, right? You've taken somebody and you've mixed them for any period of time with probably people who are more sophisticated criminals than they are. They're going to talk shop. They're going to talk about, I guess, how to commit crime better, right? But at the same time, again, I've taken away your job. I've taken away your house. I've probably taken away your children. Now you have a record, right? So if that comes forward, if a potential employer finds out that you did spend time in jail, they're less likely to want to hire you. Or if they see, these this history of being uninvolved or struggling to get homeless or struggling to get housing, again, it makes everything that much harder. An employer doesn't want to hire you on, or if you don't have secure housing, you don't have an address to send the paycheck, you don't, if you're not coming from a secure house, transportation to your job can be difficult if you show up late repeatedly or you miss days, especially if you still have your child and you don't have childcare. You're more likely to be fired again, because you're considered unreliable, right? We create these scenarios and then we blame people for them, right? But if we foster instability in your life, that's problematic. So if you end up stealing because you don't have food or shelter, and that's what puts you back in, or you violate your parole because, again, you didn't have transportation to get there in time, or whatever the case is, everything's kind of like a gotcha moment for an awful lot of people. Again, we put up lots of barriers and then jump on them when the barrier gets in their way, and we're surprised and we blame them for that.
yeah,
And I
drugs
just
are a factor
I
too, right?
I think for people who aren't kind of really familiar with how hard it is to be poor and how hard it is to have intersections with the judicial system, we just think it's easy. You're a good person, you don't commit crime, and life is good to you, and you have a job, and you keep your head down, and you have a family. And I think it seems easy for some of us, and we fail to realize how hard that really is.
I mean, selective law enforcement might have something to do with it too. I mean, drugs are an issue here too.
Yes.
I would think it'd be remiss not to even mention it. I mean, a lot of the people that are in jail because they had a little bit of marijuana on them. And now the state of Illinois is not, I mean, at certain levels, they're not even prosecuting that, right?
Right.
And there's still people in jail for that same thing. That I think the statistics bear this out. I don't have to look it up, that drug enforcement happens more frequently and more often in communities where people don't have money to pay for lawyers, namely, poor Black and brown communities, right? I don't, you might not see the same type of drug raids going on in Schaumburg, even though, as you do perhaps on the south side of Chicago, even though you've got people using drugs in Schaumburg. I remember reading a few years ago, there were a couple of police officers in Schaumburg who were selling drugs that,
Yes.
that got caught. So it's not an issue that sees color or boundaries or zip codes or tax-based districts or anything like that. It's a factor. So if anybody listening to this has ever possessed marijuana or cocaine and just continue to live their life free, is then, even though they're not caught, guilty of a crime that many people are
Right.
sitting in a prison cell for right now.
Right. Absolutely. Yes.
Um, so bail, we talked about bail. I want to talk about the trespass thing, because that's the one that everybody brings up. They're saying, if somebody trespasses on your property, I'm sorry, I'm laughing, but it sounds a little ridiculous. I would be against if the police couldn't do anything about somebody trespassing on your property. I would not be okay with that as a voter.
Right.
So is that,
Right.
tell me about, so when the law changes in January, is somebody going to be able to walk into my house and not be detained by the police?
No. No.
Okay.
Um,
Can I bring up the statute on this one? Actually, I wanted to do this because this is the one that gets me the most. Because when I hear this, I think, what a dystopia. I can just imagine somebody walk in your house and you call the police and they say, well, sorry, buddy, we can't do anything because we can give that person a ticket, but you got to let them stay.
So this is part of, what's being negotiated now is there a better way that we can refine the words, right? The words matter. The words
Yeah, well,
very
let's
much
talk
matter.
about the words. I'm sorry to
And
interrupt
I
you, but
think,
let's talk about the
and
words.
I don't have the words in front of me.
I
So
have
I'll
them in
tell you
front of
to
me.
pick them up.
So,
But I think at the core of the issue, right, is
mhm.
just kind of like we were talking about before. This is not happening in a vacuum. We have an awful lot of history about how laws have not been equally applied to all persons. And I think that we're trying to talk about the complexities of situations, right? There's a difference between a homeless person who has fallen asleep in front of a closed store and a trespasser who is on your property with the intent to rob and harm you. And they're not the same, and they shouldn't be treated the same. And I think again, it is an effort to remind officers to use all the tools in their toolbox. I think very often we see that depending on your skin color, the officer might tell you, you shouldn't be here right now. I'm going to give you the opportunity to leave of your own accord, and you go away. And other people, you go straight to arrest. And so you've gone from 0 to 60 immediately. And I think, again, it's a question of, can you look at the merits of the situation and figure out what is the best thing to do here, and again, apply it more equally. If the officer arrives on scene and determines that trespasser is on your property with the intent to harm you, absolutely they can arrest. There is no question about that. That is what those words are meant to say. Again, it's very hard to be specific in words on paper that will apply to a variety of situations. So you're trying to find words that allow flexibility for how the officer can interpret what's happening on the scene. But when you allow flexibility, I think you allow a lot of interpretations. And some interpretations have been, well, there's nothing he can do. It's a ticket. But that is not the intent of the language. And so our question is, can we refine those words to kind of better capture the intent, and so that it's less subjective in its interpretation?
Okay, so you don't want to change the rules because the law's passed, right? The law about this trespass issue, for example, this detainer ticket, this law is passed. What you're saying is the Democrats don't want to change what's going to happen in the future. They just want to change the wording to make it more clear. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so I think you're asking what is the intent, and I think the intent again is to make sure that we look at our history and we understand that the law has not always been equally applied. And
But can we
again,
look at it at a practical sense? I'm sorry to interrupt you because I really want to look at the words because I'll be honest, to me, it's actually kind of clear. Okay, so I'll read it. Law enforcement shall issue a citation in lieu of custodial arrest. In other words, you get a ticket instead of arresting. Upon proper identification for those accused of traffic and Class B and C criminal misdemeanor offenses or petty and business offenses. There's a comma after that, not a period. So it goes on. Who pose no obvious threat to the community or any person. All right. Or obvious, there's more, or obvious medical or mental health issues that pose a risk to their own safety. So the first part of the sentence, the first clause says, if you're committing these sorts of misdemeanors, of which could be trespass, you should get a ticket instead of being arrested, unless you pose a risk to somebody or yourself, right?
right.
So the controversy there is, the police get to determine who poses a risk, right? Is
Yes,
that
and
the
I
controversy?
think people are fixating on the you get a ticket, right? So I think for many people, many of us, I'm not a lawyer either, right? So the idea that someone is trespassing, that concept sounds alarming. And are we trained to understand the difference, or what we would want to happen? Is that a reasonable response to the situation at hand?
Well, because trespassing is if you're going onto a property legally, so you're going onto a property with the intent of stealing or doing some kind of harm, right? So let's talk about the No, or you don't agree?
Like I said, I don't know that I would agree. Again, what is the legal definition? I don't know that I would say that. I think that you can be caught trespassing because you didn't realize you were on private property, because you were loitering and hanging out and smoking a cigarette, and you were closer to the person's house than they wanted you to be. I think that we do have to ask questions about, what does trespassing mean? Why were you there? And what was the intent? I think that would be unique case to case. And again, I don't know that I'm the kind of person that could bring up all possible cases of trespassing that might fall into these buckets.
Okay, so knowingly entering or remaining within a building without permission, within or on a building without permission. So there's an intent element there.
So there's the knowingly, right? But
Yeah.
yes, okay. So if you're a homeless person and you have wandered into what you presumed was a vacant building or a closed building, yes, are you knowingly there? Maybe you are knowingly there. Maybe you're not. Maybe you didn't realize. But again, should you be arrested, or should you be encouraged to leave, or should you be ticketed? I think depending on what
It
is the
depends on the
case at
situation.
hand,
Yeah.
I think
So
that's the question.
how many of us have walked into a construction site? They're building a new house in your neighborhood, and you want to take a look, or you get too close to that. Where's the line drawn as far as what's trespassing? Whereas if you're breaking into somebody's house,
Right.
that's not just trespassing, it's breaking and entering. There's larceny involved in there. If you have a weapon, there are other charges. There's a whole other set of things. If you're talking about just misdemeanor trespass, I don't think you're talking about somebody breaking into somebody's home.
Right.
So if somebody, like you were saying, let's say somebody walks out of a bar, they had a few drinks and they sit on a stoop. Are they trespassing? Are you going to take that person to jail?
Right. And they may be drunk and incoherent and belligerent. So when you tell them to move along and they tell you to, stick it, what are you doing in that situation? Are they really a threat to society? What is an appropriate way for an officer to react? Again, I think that we could sit here all day and come up with different, you know, cases to say, well, here's an incident that might happen, and then how would you react? What should this escalate to, right?
So then where would the police be able to get their guidelines for as far as determining who they think is a threat to themselves or others?
So I believe that would be part of their training, right? So, I think that's part of it. How often is a department going to go through new training to make sure that they understand the parameters of these new rules? And again, can the words that are now written on the page in this statute, can we make them better? I think that's a question at hand. If it seems clear to you, but clearly other people are interpreting it differently and in a very alarming way. And if the officers at hand on the street don't know how to interpret the words, that's problematic. And let's see what we can do to make that better. But again, I think it's a struggle between trying to make it clear, but also not making it so restrictive that you can't react to the situation at hand.
So you want police officers to be able to use their reasonable discretion in a situation like this, where you have somebody, they might be committing misdemeanor trespass, but then you want the officer to be able to take into account other factors about whatever's going on the scene, to be able to make a decision on whether or not to ticket that person or to detain them. Is that what you're saying?
And we do that in a number of other instances, right? We've shifted our laws to talk about instances where officers should be encouraged to give warnings instead of tickets. Say if they've pulled you over for a traffic violation, is that more reasonable? Especially because many people make violations. You didn't know your taillight was out or whatever the case is, more or less innocently, right? And certainly the constant ticketing, I think was causing a lot of friction and distrust between officers and citizens, and that's certainly not what we want, right? We do want to create opportunities where they get to use discretion. I think that's difficult, especially when we talk about a difficult history that we have, or whether or not there are people that maybe react with bias, either knowing bias or unconscious bias in how they apply laws. And certainly I think that our effort is to continue to shine a light on that and train and account for that and try to work that out of our system.
Okay, so I want to build the bridge between these two concepts. Or maybe I don't know if that's the right metaphor, but it sounds like it's not a purge law, like people
It's
are
not,
calling it.
no,
We're not going to just let people do whatever they want and criminals can roam free.
right.
On the other hand, if we're being honest, nothing is perfect. There's no set of rules that's going to be, like a silver bullet that just complete that, or like the decision that makes everything exactly the way it is. I mean, part of the balance of living in a free society is always balancing rights of people versus the responsibility of the state, right? So it could be a scenario where somebody gets detained by the police after being suspected of a misdemeanor, and then later it's determined that the police officer overstepped their bounds. On the other hand, you might have a situation where somebody's not detained and then does something later, but is there whether or not there's a causal connection between what they do later and whether or not they were picked up for that one trespass thing is a different thing. So in
Right.
any event, not in any event, society still has its messes, right? There's still
Yes.
things that aren't going to be fixed.
The current system is not foolproof. And and this evolving system will not be foolproof either. And I think that's scary for citizens, right? You want it to be foolproof. You want to feel that your government and your law enforcement is capable of keeping you safe. And if you were worried that there are holes that we are incapable or unwilling to fix, that's alarming. But as you said, it will always be messy.
I mean, if you think about it this way, the government has a monopoly on violence, essentially, right? But in that, what I mean is that um, you have rights and freedoms as a person in your society, in your community, but you also pay tax money for people who have weapons that enforce the law. And so there's a give and take there, right? So I in clarifying, I guess, the wording, because I think maybe the fair criticism of the Safety Act when it comes to the trespass issue is somebody might say, well, how did the police determine what to do? They're just going to default to giving tickets because they don't want to deal with it. And that's probably not the way you'd want your police to operate. I mean, if you support them, you'd want them to have discretion to be able to take someone in who's a threat. On the other hand, what I don't get is that it doesn't, when you read the law, it doesn't say that you're going to let violent criminals go, that you're going to ticket people who break into your house, or that if you're accused of a crime, you just get to walk. None of that's in there.
So no, and again, I think for a lot of people, maybe it's the sequence of how things are written or understanding the difference between a class C, class B, or class A misdemeanor. I don't think the average person could really tell you that. And so I think it
So,
can
so
be
what I'm getting to
a
is
lot.
that this is where I kind of want to end. Is there such a thing as an undetainable offense?
No,
Okay, why is that?
because the judge always retains the right to be able to evaluate you as a flight risk, or again, be able to evaluate that you are a threat to an individual or to society at large. Now,
Uh-huh.
again, the threshold is we want him to take that seriously if he's going to accuse you of that, right? But the judge can always make that determination.
And the same thing with the scene on the street where the officer sees somebody who they think is committing a misdemeanor in those classes that we just read out in that statute. Is there an undetainable offense there too? I mean, you
No,
can still get detained if you're determined to be a risk, right?
yes, if the officer determines that you are a risk, the officer absolutely can arrest you. Now, again, we want the officer to be able to back that up, right? I mean, and that's the difficult thing. We want them to be able to give a very legitimate if they're going to arrest you and potentially ruin your life, they ought to be able to back that up with authentic information about why they thought that was so, right? So I think that's where it gets, that it is where it gets difficult, you know, but that is not a small thing. And in that officer really does have the ability to interrupt or ruin another individual's life based on his interpretation of the events. And we take that seriously. It's serious for both sides.
Yeah,
So
because on the other hand, you also don't want to tell officers, hey, you can't detain somebody who you think is going to hurt somebody else.
and that gray area is tough. That gray area is really tough for the person being accused and for that officer making that judgment. It just is. And there's no way around that. It is going to be tough. And that's why you want to make sure that they are trained to the top of their ability to be able to work through these cases. You want to make sure that they have their cameras and they're using their cameras so that we can have a record of what went on, right? And we can learn from that record and hopefully make the next interaction better. But these are all things that come together in this difficult, messy situation.
Well, you know what? I really appreciate your time, and thanks for spending so much time with me talking about these issues in depth. I wanted to leave you with the last word because I think you have an election coming up in November. And you know, if you wanted to just leave your voters with one message, or the people in your district with one message, what would that be?
Stay engaged. Democracy is difficult. Democracy is interactive, and that makes it hard. Voting is a really, really, really important step in this process. I want you to vote. I want you to feel comfortable voting. I know that's hard. A lot of people don't know the names on the ballot and they feel uneducated, and then they just sort of sit it out. One of the things that I always encourage people is if you're not feeling confident as a voter, get a vote by mail ballot. They're going to mail it right to your house. You sit at the kitchen table, you Google everybody, you phone a friend. It's like an open book test. You can feel confident about taking the time that you want to fill out that form how you want to fill it out. You don't have to feel like you walked into the box and it was a pop quiz and you didn't recognize half the names and you're either going to skip them or eeny, meeny, miny, moe your way through something that's this important. I want you to be involved in whether the person that you wanted to be elected got elected or not. Your job is not done. It's still incumbent upon you to in some way monitor what is going on with the world around you and let your elected officials know what you want to have happen. And I know that's a lot. You have a job, you have a family, you have other things to do. The idea that you're going to monitor who all of your elected officials are and what they're doing is a huge responsibility. But I will say, I encourage you to try and stay engaged on that. There are big topics being discussed right now, and they're not easy topics. Like we just figured out right here. If they were easy topics, we would fix them, we would pass laws, it would be fine. But these are complex topics when we're talking about access to reproductive health care, we're talking about gun safety, we're talking about the Safety Act, we're talking about migration, all sorts of things, right? And I want you to acknowledge how complex these things are also, and give a little grace to your elected officials trying to work through these things. And I guess that's it, you know, be involved, come out and vote, but remember it's complex. Sorry.
Representative Michelle Mussman of Illinois, thank you so much for coming on Ukraine Watch. I hope we get a chance to talk again in the future. Thank you.
I love that. Thank you.